Okay, I'd like to welcome everybody to our latest iteration of Western Naval Historical Association Q&As. And we're very fortunate today that Trent Hone is joining us and talking about Guadalcanal, which is one of the, I think, most interesting topics in naval history. It's something that we as writers go back to all the time. It's like the well that always gives. It's one of the better stories, I think. Trent has a forthcoming work on Guadalcanal, which will be out next month, I believe. One of the new Naval History Special Editions, and so I'm looking forward to that. Have you read the proofs on that, Trent? Is everything okay with that? Is it on schedule?
I don't know if it's going to be next month. I think the Naval Institute might take a little bit longer than that. I haven't seen page proofs yet, but I have gone through all the text and their edits, and it looks quite good to me. So I'm excited to see it.
Well, I will mention that the first one of these, which is Massachusetts, which I wrote 3 years ago. I can't remember how long ago. It was supposed to be published on July 15th, and it didn't make it. So we're still waiting for that to happen. So that's just a vision of what's to come. And I'm going to go ahead and cut the introductions short and turn it over to Trent very, very quickly here. And I can't think of anything else to say. So Trent, I turn it over to you. So thank you.
Okay, great. Well, the large format magazine, or the special edition that you were mentioning, focuses on the night combat actions off Guadalcanal, and that's what I'm going to focus on this talk today as well. I've done a great deal of research on the U.S. Navy's tactical doctrine and its evolution, and you say, Vince, Guadalcanal is the well that sort of keeps on giving. Guadalcanal is extremely important in that context because it marks the point where a lot of pre-war assumptions about how the U.S. Navy expects to fight, especially expects to fight night surface actions, confront the reality of combat in the Pacific. And part of the thesis that I developed in Learning War, the book that's kind of off Vince's right shoulder, is that the Navy developed a learning system before the war that helped it improve its tactical doctrine and advance it, embrace new technologies and get better through that avenue. And Guadalcanal provides examples. These 5 night service actions provide examples of that learning in action. So today I'm going to try to do 2 things. I'm going to try to put those night service actions in context, sort of both the broader strategic context, operational context, tactical context, and then highlight elements of the Navy's learning as we go through them. First, I want to get some of the context in place. The decision here to attack, and I've got Admiral Ernest King, who was Commander-in-Chief and Chief of Naval Operations at the time, here because soon after the victory at Midway in June 1942, he thinks it's very important to go on the offensive, to try to seize the initiative from the Japanese. And he thinks it's so important, in fact, that he orders Admiral Nimitz to begin an offensive in the South Pacific, specifically to seize the anchorage at Tulagi, which is across the sound from Guadalcanal, initiate Operation Watchtower, before he gains approval from his peers on the Joint Chiefs of Staff. He gets that retroactively, of course, they buy into this idea, but it gives you some sense of how aggressive King felt he needed to be and how important it was to begin to take the offensive. Now, Nimitz agrees with this. Nimitz also has an aggressive disposition, but I think something that's important to stress is that they're deliberately subordinating thorough preparation, being fully prepared logistically and through other means for this offensive, to the need to move aggressively and try to capture the initiative. One of the reasons is because King is apprehensive about the lines of communication between the west coast of the United States and Australia. The site here, Tulagi and Guadalcanal, Tulagi is a very nice anchorage. It can be an effective harbor. And when they find out that the Japanese are planning to build an airfield across the sound on the island of Guadalcanal, it becomes more important to try to seize this position, prevent the Japanese from threatening these lines of communication. And the theory is that that can be the first step in an offensive that will move northwest through the Solomon Islands and ultimately recapture the stronghold at Rabaul, which is the embedded base. Obviously, Rabaul doesn't actually get seized, but that is the intention when this happens in the middle of 1942. Now, so that's some strategic context, some context in terms of the U.S. Navy's tactical doctrine and how it was conceptualized, sort of how the apex that it reaches after the interwar period and as the United States is coming into World War II. King's emphasis on aggressive action to try to seize the initiative comes from these heuristics that the U.S. Navy was embracing. And here I'm using Daniel Kahneman's term, the Nobel Prize winning economist. He posits a heuristic is sort of a shortcut to decision making. It's often subconscious. It is entrained or ingrained through habit, through repetition. And the exercises, both the large fleet problems and other tactical exercises that the United States Navy was undertaking in the interwar period, reinforce a number of different heuristics, but I think three are most important. One of these is acting aggressively to try to seize the initiative both in battle and at the operational level. The second one here, attacking effectively first. This is Wayne Hughes's term, obviously from his fleet tactics book or series of books, the three different editions. So the Navy at the time wouldn't have used that term, but they would have recognized its importance, right? You want to be the first one to strike a decisive blow so that you can then begin to capitalize on that and have the positive repercussions that come from it in combat or, again, operationally. And then to help ensure that, there's an emphasis on decentralized decision-making or decentralized action. And there's a logic to this, because if there are momentary and fleeting opportunities in battle, then it's extremely important to encourage subordinates to take advantage of them without waiting on instructions from higher level commands. And the Navy does this in two ways. One, in battle, it's encouraging this kind of individual initiative, but it's also encouraging it when it comes to doctrinal development, when it comes to evolving new tactical forms. And you can see this happen in the fleet problems and other exercises in the interwar period. It also happens off Guadalcanal, and I'll touch on some of those instances. One of the things that I think is quite interesting about the Navy in this period, the title of this slide, Tactical and Operational Heuristics. These start out as tactical concepts, but as officers progress through their careers, like King, like Nimitz, and others, they take these concepts with them into the behaviors that they employ at higher levels. So what start out as tactical approaches become ways to engage operationally. And you see that in the decision to initiate this offensive so quickly. It's Operation Watchtower. Like I said, most of you are probably familiar with that concept and also then familiar with these four commanders who are involved. Vice Admiral Robert Gormley there in the center. He's commander in the South Pacific. The offensive is ultimately his responsibility. On the left, we have Frank Jack Fletcher. He commands the attack force, and specifically, he is responsible for the carrier group that is covering it. The two officers on the right, we have Richmond Kelly Turner, who commands the amphibious force, and then Major General Alexander Vandergrift, who's commanding the 1st Marine Division, which will occupy Guadalcanal, Tulagi, and some of the other nearby islands. The landings take place on schedule on the 7th of August. There had been a little bit of delay. The original plan was to land on the 1st of August, but once the date is set at the 7th, they go forward. And although the Japanese offer fierce resistance on Tulagi and nearby islands on the northern part of the Sound, on Guadalcanal, they sort of fade relatively quickly into the jungle, and Vandergrift and his men capture the unfinished airfield on Guadalcanal on the first day. Soon it will be christened Henderson Field after a Marine aviator who lost his life at Midway. Now, the Japanese response is fairly swift, and it's also aggressive. There are aerial attacks that strike Turner's amphibious force on the 7th, again on the 8th, and a more potent strike is on its way, commanded by Vice Admiral Mikawa Gunichi. Pictured here, he is the commander of the Imperial Japanese Navy's 8th Fleet. He gathers together a mixed group, a pickup team of ships that are available to him. It's an impromptu striking force of 7 cruisers and 1 destroyer. Mikawa's flagship is the large cruiser Chokai, which is an excellent representation of the kind of emphasis that the Japanese had placed on striking power, offensive capability for ships of this type. Right, she's got 10 8-inch guns. She's got a series of very large torpedo tubes, and you can see from her large superstructure, she's got a proliferation of control and spotting positions that make it easier for her crew and her commanders to identify targets at night and bring weapons to bear on them. And so Mikawa, with Chokai in the lead, steams toward Guadalcanal. They're sighted during the approach, and word reaches Turner and his screen commander, Rear Admiral Crutchley of the Royal Navy, who's seconded at that time to the Royal Australian Navy. They have time from these sighting reports. They could have made some adjustments, but it appears that they never really took the potential of a night surface action seriously. One of the reasons for that, most likely, is that one of the sighting reports suggests that Mikawa has 2 seaplane tenders. And so Turner appears to have focused on the idea that, well, the Japanese will create a nearby seaplane base and they will attack me with their seaplanes. If a night surface action happens, we will count on the disposition of our forces to give us early enough warning to be able to thwart or counter that effort. As I'm sure many of you know, it doesn't work out terribly well. There are 3 different screening groups that are positioned to guard the main entrances to Salvo Sound, where the battle eventually occurs. 2 large or heavy cruiser groups are disposed on the western side, and there's a light cruiser group on the eastern side. Outside of the western entrances are 2 picket destroyers that should be using their radar to provide early warning of the Japanese approach. It doesn't work. The radar does not give early warning, and the arrangement of the ships is the other screening forces is such that they're not really well disposed to coordinate at night or act together. Some of the U.S. commanders, particularly Captain Frederick Reefcall, who's commanding the northern of the 2 groups that are on the western side, is very concerned that they're so far apart, believes it's going to be very difficult to coordinate, becomes concerned about friendly fire, and this is one of the things that begins to happen. Now, the disposition, if you look at U.S. Navy screening approaches, doesn't seem to conform very well to pre-war practice. The use of radar picket destroyers does. It's certainly an element of pre-war doctrine, but Turner is very willing to allow Crutchley to dispose his screening forces as he sees fit. As I mentioned, it doesn't work out well. The screening destroyers, Blue and Ralph Talbot, they do not detect Mikawa's approach. There is no warning. By the time Mikawa's ships are seen, they have already fired torpedoes at the southern of the 2 western screening groups, and they open fire very quickly thereafter. Crutchley had intended to command that group himself, but he was in conference with Turner that evening. Was deciding what to do because he and Turner were expecting that Fletcher and the aircraft carriers would be leaving the next day, and Crutchley takes his flagship, Cruiser Australia, with him. So the southern group has just 2 cruisers, Canberra, pictured here after the battle, and the United States Navy's Chicago. Chicago is damaged by a torpedo, and she heads off to the west, chasing shadows and effectively leaving the battle. Canberra is struck by at least 2 dozen shells, potentially a torpedo. There's some dispute about that. Some claim it was an American torpedo. I think that may be unlikely, but regardless, she is left helpless and in a serious state. Mikawa and his group turn north and come after Captain Frederick Reefcall and his 3 cruisers. They're Astoria, Quincy, and Vincennes. This is probably the last picture taken of Astoria. This is from the 6th of August, the day before the landings on Guadalcanal. And like Canberra, she was hit repeatedly. Fires break out. You can see amidships. She has airplanes and a hangar. There's lots of flammable material among the airplanes in the hangar. They burn. The fires rage out of control, and she sinks the next day. The other American cruisers fare worse. I'm sure all of you have at one time or another seen this picture of Quincy. This is her during the battle, taken from one of the Japanese ships. And this is her captain, Samuel N. Moore. Now, the title of this presentation comes from one of Moore's last orders. As Mikawa's column turned north and approached these three cruiser groups, it lost some cohesion and split into two. So as Quincy is being hit, Moore realizes that there are Japanese to the right and to the left, and he gives an order to Henry Henneberger, his gunnery officer, and says, give them hell, we are going between them. Moore goes down with his ship. Quincy is hit by numerous shells and at least 2 torpedoes. She sinks about 20 minutes after the first hits score. Vincennes is also crippled similarly and sunk. She's hit by a torpedo. She burns, and she goes down about 15 minutes after Quincy. So this is a crippling and stunning defeat. Mikawa leaves. There's some criticism about his decision-making. Should he have remained and sought out the Allied transports and thereby potentially ruining the potential for a sustained campaign at Guadalcanal? I think it's very easy to offer that kind of criticism from this distance. I mean, Mikawa enters a very close, sound where the land is very nearby. He sneaks in, he achieves surprise, he destroys 2 cruiser groups in turn, and now his formation is no longer cohesive. Some of his ships have actually been hit, not seriously damaged, but they have been hit. And so I think escaping after winning such a tremendous victory is probably the best decision to regain cohesion, get out of the way, and make sure that he can't be hit by planes from Fletcher's carriers the next morning. Regardless, it is stunning in terms of what it does to American decision-making. Gormley believes now it's too risky to send surface forces to the waters off Guadalcanal at night. And Turner, deprived of his screening forces, he has to withdraw before he unloads all the supplies that Vandergrift was expecting or will likely require. Now, it also has another important influence because the radar destroyers that are outside the Sound were expected to provide warning, and they don't. So what is radar really capable of? Now we know in areas like the Solomons, the kinds of radars that were on the destroyers, the SC radars, relatively early search radars in the US Navy, weren't very effective. And it's easy to have a signal from a ship or something else that you want to detect get lost around the clutter. Part of the reason is because they have an A-scope presentation, which is basically like an oscilloscope. You can see it here on the left. Range is the horizontal axis. The strength of the return signal is the vertical axis. And you can see how this might be difficult to make sense of, particularly if it gets a lot of interference, if there's a lot of noise in the return. And this is what happened. Now, we are all more familiar intuitively when we think of a radar display, we think of a planned position indicator display, that's on the right. The only radar that had a planned position indicator display at this time was the SG radar, a more sophisticated search radar, and only a few ships had it. So there is doubt now among American commanders, among Gormley, there's doubt. It's risky to send ships to Guadalcanal. I'm not sure we should do it. And amongst lower level commanders, we're not sure what radar can really do. We can't rely on it like we were expecting to before the war. But Vandergrift has Guadalcanal, or at least has a defensible perimeter, and the airfield is in that perimeter. And so Gormley, the others plan to rely on air power to try to ensure that they can cover this exposed position that Vandegrift now holds. And Hendersonfield gets into operation relatively quickly. The Japanese make a major effort to try to retake the island. This triggers the Battle of the Eastern Solomons, one of the 4 major carrier battles of 1942. There is enough, it's not as clear-cut a victory as Midway say, but the battle prevents that Japanese effort. And after that, the campaign struggles or devolves into an attritional struggle. The Japanese, because they can contest the aerial superiority that the Allies enjoy off Guadalcanal, but they can't overcome it. And so they rely on nocturnal missions to move troops and supplies to the island, what the Marines call the Tokyo Express. They experiment with barges. It doesn't work out too well. They're slow, they're too vulnerable. But destroyers do work. Now, Nimitz begins to get concerned. So he's commander-in-chief of the Pacific Fleet. He's in Hawaii. And one of the things he's concerned about is Gormley is not contesting these Japanese incursions to the island. He's not challenging their ability to bring troops and men to the troops and supplies to the island. And he's also worried about morale. He's getting reports from people who are coming back from the South Pacific that morale is low, both in Gormley's command and in General MacArthur's Southwest Pacific Command. So he wants to go down there and see for himself. Holds a conference with Gormley before proceeding on to Guadalcanal. This is him at Guadalcanal. He's pictured with Vandegrift. They have some of their staff members here. And this visit is important for 3 reasons. Nimitz becomes convinced that Gormley can, or that Vandegrift can hold the position if he gets enough support. And so Nimitz urges Gormley to provide that support and specifically to send an army regiment, the 164th Infantry Regiment of the Americal Division, to Guadalcanal to reinforce Vandegrift's perimeter. And Gormley also resolves to begin to act a bit more aggressively and to form a surface action group that can contest these Japanese incursions to the island. And that sets up the Battle of Cape Esperance, which is the second of the major night surface actions off Guadalcanal, fought in mid-October. And here, Rear Admiral Norman Scott and his Task Force 64, they provide close cover. Essentially, they move ahead of the convoy that is bringing the Army's 164th Infantry Regiment to the island to ensure that they can make it and they can make it safely. And so when they get word, when Scott gets word that there's a Japanese force that could potentially interfere with that, he moves to intervene. Now, Scott's flagship is the cruiser San Francisco. He drills his crew, prepares them for night battle, drills his formation. And as an example of wartime adaptation, he adopts a formation that is not similar to things seen before the war, but I think is a reaction to what happened at Savo, right? At Savo, there was distributed formations. It was very difficult to coordinate them. It didn't work. And so Scott wants to have a very tight formation, one that is going to prevent that kind of confusion, one that is going to prevent that kind of friendly fire. He calls it a double header. It's a short line. He's got 4 cruisers in the center, and he's got destroyers to the van and rear, 3 in the van, 2 in the rear. And he thinks this is going to ease coordination, it's going to reduce the risk of friendly fire, and it's going to allow him to maximize his firepower. Now, 2 of Scott's cruisers are large light cruisers of the Brooklyn type. One is Boise, we see her here before the war, and the other is the near sister Helena. And both of these have the SG radar. They have the SG radar with the PPI scope. This is not from the Battle of Cape Esperance, but this is from one of the later battles in 1943 as the Allies advance up through the Solomons. So you can get a sense of what these displays actually look like under these operational conditions. And here you can see it's fairly easy to make out different pips. So these radars give Boise and Helena a significant advantage in terms of situational awareness. So not entirely surprising, as Scott's formation is patrolling outside of the entrance to Savo Sound, outside of Cape Esperance, Boise and Helena are the first to make sense of the fact that the Japanese are approaching. Now, Scott knew that it was likely that he was going to encounter an enemy formation. He had word from scouting reports that this was going to happen, and he's got his line positioned here across the entrance. Now, his opponent is Rear Admiral Goto Aramoto, and his mission is to take his 3 heavy cruisers, Aoba, Furutaka, Kinugasa, and bombard Henderson Field, right, to try to reduce the ability of the planes there to interfere with Japanese plans and operations. Now, before Scott realizes that the Japanese are approaching, he orders a reversal of course, and this causes his formation to lose cohesion because his cruisers turn at the same time as his van destroyers. They turn simultaneously, and there's some dispute as to whether or not this was intentional. There's an argument that it was intentional to break the line like this because it kept the fire of his cruisers from being as massed as long as it would have been, but it certainly leads to a fair amount of confusion because Scott is making the turn. The van destroyers are not in position yet, and now Boise and Helena start to report, hey, we think we have an enemy contact. And Boise does it in a very curious way, reporting bogeys, which those of us now who are familiar with some of these terminology would probably assume meant aerial contacts, but Boise meant surface contacts. There just wasn't the kind of standardization of these terms in place yet. But that does create some confusion. Are you tracking airplanes or are you tracking ships? We don't know. We have to have an exchange of information to learn more. And as the Japanese begin to close, Scott is still uncertain of the danger. He thinks that these ships may be tracking van destroyers. He's worried that there's about to be an instance of friendly fire. However, the cruisers, particularly Helena and even Salt Lake City at this point, who does not have an SD radar, they are convinced that this is the enemy. And once they become visible, once they can see them with the naked eye, Captain Gilbert Hoover of the Helena sends a very interesting signal to the flagship. Now, the code word for opening fire was Roger, and so he sends interrogatory Roger, which is essentially, can we start shooting? Now, unfortunately, also, Roger is a way to acknowledge a message. So this message arrives at San Francisco. San Francisco says Roger, meaning to say, we got your message. Hoover interprets it liberally, believes, okay, now I have permission to open fire and I know where the opponent is, and so we're going to do it. So from the rear of Scott's line, the cruisers start to shoot, right? Helena, then Salt Lake City, Boise, and then finally his flagship, San Francisco. The Japanese are caught by surprise because Goto has no inkling that the Americans are there, and he's very concerned because there is another Japanese formation inside the Sound that night delivering troops and supplies to Guadalcanal, that he is a victim of friendly fire. Oh no, we have run across friendlies and we're being shot at. Quick, tell them that we too are Japanese, flash recognition signals, stop them from shooting. Goto is mortally wounded before he can really make sense of what is going on, and he is afraid, that this has been a terrible accident. However, his cruiser's going to survive. She turns to starboard. She's hit by some 24 shells. This is a picture of her after the battle of the anchorage in the Shortlands, but she is essentially rendered hors de combat very quickly. Furutaka is the next cruiser in line. She follows Aoba around to starboard. And so she's going through the same water that the U.S. cruisers have been shooting at. And she is also hit heavily. A fire breaks out from a hit among her torpedo tubes. It's fed by the oxygen that fuels them. And that she burns liberally. More hits knock out power to her engine room. And she loses the battle against flooding eventually and will sink. Kinugasa turns the other way. Turns to port, slips away, or not away, but disappears momentarily into the darkness and avoids the worst of the initial salvos of the U.S. cruisers. Now, Scott orders a ceasefire twice. The first time initially because oh my gosh, my ships are shooting, and I'm worried they're shooting at the destroyers. Well, some of them were. Some of those ships ceased firing that first time. Well, not really cease, but they pause momentarily to make sure they're targets, to make sure they know who they are shooting at. And then later, Scott orders a ceasefire to regroup his forces so that he can turn to the northwest and pursue the fleeing Japanese. And during this time, Kinugasa gets a good solution on the US cruiser line and starts to open fire. And she straddles some of the ships, and she also hits Boise with a diving shell. And this is, I believe, the most famous instance of one of these shells that's deliberately designed to land short, pass through the water, and then hit the side of the ship below the waterline, and there detonate. And that's exactly what it does. You can see from these images that are enclosed in the damage analysis of Boise what happens. The star here in the 6-inch magazine, that is where the shell explodes. It so enters the sides of this hull, detonates there. All the red areas are burned out. So flames shoot high. Scott is concerned that the ship is going to be lost. The hole created by the shell entering the side of the ship fortunately allows an influx of water. So although a lot of this powder burns, it does not burn so rapidly as to shatter the hull of the ship. Water floods in, puts out some of the fires, and Boise is able to survive. But this is, a very devastating hit, and I think a great example of some of the technological work that the Japanese were doing to try to come up with sophisticated means of damaging opposing ships. But these kinds of diving shells didn't always work very often in practice. But here did. Excellent example. Now, so Kinugasa escapes, Boise survives, and Furuotaka is sunk along with the destroyer Fubuki. Now, Scott also loses the destroyer Duncan. His destroyer Fahrenhold is holed by some of his own cruisers. So that some of the van destroyers are damaged by friendly fire. And so Scott's objectives for his compact line don't really work out. It does keep the line together, but it doesn't prevent friendly fire and it doesn't prevent confusion. But it does allow the Army Infantry Regiment to make it to Guadalcanal and to augment Vandegrift's perimeter. But it doesn't mean that the US Navy now has control of the waters off Guadalcanal, because just 2 days later, Vice Admiral Kurita Tekio comes to Guadalcanal and he brings 2 battleships, Congo and Aruna. I have this title of this slide, "The Bombardment," in quotes, because that is how the defenders of Guadalcanal knew it, right? 2 battleships show up and bombard Henderson Field for a while, and it leaves an impression. This destroys more than half of the available planes at Henderson Field, and it covers the arrival of about 10,000 Japanese troops. Now, back at Pearl Harbor, Nimitz is extremely concerned. And he writes, quote, "The situation is not hopeless, but it is certainly critical. Something needs to get done." And he consults with his staff, especially those who went with him to the South Pacific, to gain a sense of Gormley's ability to continue leading in the South Pacific and whether or not it makes sense to relieve him. The staff agrees that it would make sense to relieve him. A quick message to Admiral King confirms that King is okay with the idea as well. And Vice Admiral William Halsey is on his way to the South Pacific to take command of the carrier forces there. But Nimitz decides that he will take command of the South Pacific in its entirety. And so he does. Halsey calls it quite the hot potato that he receives. And he thinks that he has to start throwing punches almost immediately, because there is another Japanese effort now underway to retake the island, a combination of offensives on the island itself and an approach of powerful naval forces. Halsey sends the carriers under the command of Rear Admiral Thomas Kincaid north of the Santa Cruz Islands, resulting in the 4th of the large carrier battles of 1942, Battle of Santa Cruz. And in the fight there, now, I think this is just in some ways, if I can depart for a second, just a wonderful example of how effective Japanese carrier air groups were. The attacks that they mount on Hornet are extremely impressive and well coordinated. Hornet is lost, but there is sufficient victory on the ground between the soldiers and the Marines. They withstand the Japanese attempts to take the airfield. That combined with enough damage to the Japanese carrier Shokaku to force a withdrawal. And so this next attempt, major Japanese attempt to retake the island, is defeated. Halsey moves quickly, reinforce the island again, make sure that we have enough soldiers and Marines there to continue to hold the perimeter. So the 182nd Regiment of the American Cal Division now comes to Guadalcanal. The transports leave Noumea on 8th November. That same day, Halsey comes to Guadalcanal. He visits Vandegrift. And after their conversation, Halsey promises to support Vandegrift. There's a determination in the position of Comstock and Halsey now to hold this island, to hold the position, to ensure that they can win at Guadalcanal. This sets up a pair of battles that are going to be fought in mid-November. The first of these is the night of 12-13 November. This is the first naval battle of Guadalcanal. This is Daniel Callahan's fight, Rear Admiral Daniel Callahan. By the evening of the 12th, the American reinforcements are safely ashore. The transports are withdrawing. Their screening forces are withdrawing. Callahan is commanding one of them. Scott, Rear Admiral Norman Scott, is commanding another. And word comes that the Japanese are intent on replicating the bombardment. Right? They've sent 2 battleships toward the island. They're under the command of Vice Admiral Abe Hiroaki. And the intent here is to knock out the airfield, or at least, cripple it once more, so that another large reinforcement effort with 11 transports can come to Guadalcanal and reinforce the Japanese garrison there. Halsey knows that he's got to do something to stop them. Turner knows he's got to do something to stop them. And so they collect their screening forces under the command of Callahan and send it back into Sound. Callahan essentially has a merger of 2 task groups, his own and now Rear Admiral Scott, who is flying his flag at this point in the light cruiser Atlanta. And Scott and Callahan have got to figure out what they are going to do to try to thwart this bombardment, because they are outnumbered and they are outgunned. And one of the battleships that they're facing, Abe's flagship, is Hiei, which is the most modern of these old, what were battle cruisers, now are modernized fast battleships. Hiei had been disarmed in the interwar period, not completely disarmed, but it turned into a trading ship, and then rearmed after the abandonment of the treaty regime and used as a prototype for the fire control systems that were put on the battleships of the Yamato class. So she is quite well equipped. And then she's paired with battleship Kurishima. This is a picture of her in, I believe, the early 30s, if I remember right. So she's more modern than this by the time this battle is happening in 1942. Now, Callahan, most likely for the ease of control, adopts a linear formation, very much as Scott did, but the assumptions that held with Scott's formation don't really hold with what Callahan is trying to do, because he's got a larger group of ships. He's got 13 ships. The line is very long. He puts 5 cruisers in the center. There's 8 destroyers, 4 at the van and rear. So this really lacks the compactness of Scott's double header. We have to reconstruct what Callahan was thinking, because he didn't leave a battle plan. He didn't communicate it. He didn't really express his intentions to his subordinates, and he deserves to be criticized for that. But the evidence suggests that what he was planning to do was to take his 3 large cruisers, Helena, Portland, and his flagship San Francisco, operate them as a unit, and try to bring them close to the enemy battleships one at a time and overwhelm them with close range gunfire. You can get a sense of how challenging that might be just by, how I just described it. And if witness reports are to be believed, his flag captain, Cassin Young, felt like that was a suicidal approach, which may give us some indication as to why Callahan did not share this plan with his subordinates. Now, in the meantime, he's going to do something with his destroyers that is very similar to pre-war plans. So there were a number of pre-war approaches that would bring together U.S. Navy heavy cruisers and destroyers in night search and attack operations. And these formations were designed to allow the cruisers to use their gunfire to open a hole in an enemy screen, basically to sink enemy destroyers or light cruisers that might interfere with destroyers attempting to break into that formation and attack heavy ships at the center of it with torpedoes. So Callahan's going to send his destroyers into the heart of the enemy formation. And it seems, based on the orders that he gave, that he expected Atlanta and Juneau, his smallest light cruisers that were at either end of his cruiser line, to support and to operate with the destroyers. He may have expected Scott to help control them somewhat. Now, I suspect these, Callahan was thinking of these ideas not just because of the orders that he gave, but also because he had been captain of San Francisco before the war. I believe that's one of the reasons he chose it to be his flagship. He was familiar with the crew, he was familiar with the ship, and having been her captain, he would have been familiar with the drills and the routines and the practices that use these kinds of tactics to try to penetrate enemy formations. So it's logical that he would fall back to these kinds of ideas. And once more, as he's moving into the Sound, he's got this linear formation. He's steaming past Lunga Point, the Marines perimeter, and as before at Cape Esperance, Helena's radar, her SG radar, provides the earliest warning of the approaching Japanese. She reports contacts almost 32,000 yards away. The bearing she reports is 310 degrees. And Callahan immediately sets course to collide with the Japanese formation. He doesn't try to cross the T, as Scott was able to do. He's trying to crash into the Japanese formation. And instead of using his cruisers to punch a hole with their gunfire, I think what he's hoping or counting on is he's going to use his van destroyers to create enough confusion to punch a hole into the Japanese formation. This is kind of what happens. The van destroyers encountered the enemy first, and when they did, the battle erupts. Shooting starts. Now, the specific sequence here is a little uncertain. We know that the Japanese illuminated Callahan's column, and then firing breaks out more or less immediately. Some U.S. ships report that they opened fire before the Japanese opened fire on them. Others say, nope, Japanese opened fire first, and then we started shooting because no reason to ask permission anymore. We're being shot at. Callahan doesn't help the situation. He issues a very unfortunate order. Odd ships commence firing to starboard, even ships fire to port. This causes some ships that had developed good fixes on potential targets to swing their guns to the other direction and to try to acquire a target either right before the shooting erupts. So at the outset, U.S. firing is not as accurate as it might be. Now, this is when Callahan orders his destroyers to head north, courses 000, through the Japanese formation. This resonates with what I was saying before. He's trying to send them through, and many of them have close range encounters with Abe's flagship, battleship Hiei. That's what's depicted here in the painting. Hiei is there off to the left, and of those destroyers, there's a handful of them that get very close, shoot at Hiei as depicted here in the picture with their 5-inch guns. Some of them fire even smaller caliber weapons, 1.1 inch or 40 millimeter, whatever they happen to have, they can bring to bear. Laffey came the closest. According to her action reports and eyewitness testimony, she passes within 10 yards of Hiei, almost rams. She fisttails her stern out of the way to prevent a collision. And this kind of close range firing, not only with main armament, but with small anti-aircraft batteries, automatic weapons fire, this sort of thing had been modeled in fleet problems before the war. There are a number of reports where these kinds of night actions erupted, and they say, well, if our battleships get in very close to destroyers, they're going to rake the upper works with gunfire. They're going to be able to knock out control positions. They're going to make it very difficult to operate a battleship under those conditions. It's exactly the kind of thing that starts to happen to Abe's flagship. Now, at one point, Callahan orders a ceasefire. This is most likely prompted by his realization that San Francisco is being fired or is firing on Atlanta. Now, San Francisco's gunnery is very accurate. She hits Atlanta with quite a few shells out of a salvo. Scott is killed on Atlanta's bridge, and Callahan most likely recognized this and ordered a ceasefire. Now, what's interesting is when Portland, Captain Lawrence DeBose of Portland asked Callahan, hey, and what's in the TBS log is kind of amusing to me. What's the dope? Do you want a ceasefire? And the response is yes. And so why? Why is Callahan saying we're going to stop shooting, at least with the large cruisers at this point, in the midst of a battle? And I think what he's trying to do is carry out his plan. He's trying to obscure the approach of his 3 heavy cruisers toward the Japanese flagship. And over TBS, he says, we want the big ones. So he's trying to get closer. But only San Francisco really gets close because Portland's stern is destroyed by a torpedo. She starts to cruise in circles, that her warped stern acts like a rudder. Helena becomes distracted by targets of opportunity. At one point, all 3 of her batteries are engaged at 3 separate targets. The main battery is firing at one, the secondaries are firing at something else, and then she opens up with her 40 millimeter guns on the 3rd target. So San Francisco closes with Hiei, and they exchange fire. Callahan is killed. Captain Cassie Young is mortally wounded, and command of the ship quickly passes to junior officers. The secondary conning position is knocked out, and they try to get the ship to safety and honestly just keep it afloat. You can get some sense of the damage. Each white circle here is a hit that the ship sustained in the battle. But Hiei is also hit by the destroyers, by San Francisco. Her communications are knocked out, so the Japanese formation is effectively decapitated. She's able to withdraw, but not very far. And after repeated aerial attacks the next day, she's scuttled. So Callahan loses Atlanta and 4 destroyers, but most of his formation is damaged, wrecked, horrors the combat. Juno is sunk on her way back to Espiritu Santo by a Japanese submarine the next day. But it's got really important implications, what Callahan does. It delays the departure of this Japanese formation of transports, the 11 transports. Another Japanese formation, this time with cruisers, bombards Henderson Field the following night. It's not as devastating as the battleships would have been, but they hope it's enough. So the transports start out down the slot. They head toward Guadalcanal, but they are discovered and they're attacked by planes from Carrier Enterprise, planes from Henderson Field. And by the end of the day, just 4 out of the 11 are still on their way to Guadalcanal. So the Japanese believe, okay, we've got to do something else. We've got to hit the airfield again. And so they plan another bombardment. Battleship Kirishima is going to return to Iron Bottom Sound along with 2 heavy cruisers. This time, Vice Admiral Kondo Nobutaki is going to command them. And Halsey sends his last surface action group, 2 battleships and 4 destroyers under Rear Admiral Willis Lee, to stop it. And so this is the second naval battle of Guadalcanal. Lee's flagship is Battleship Washington. Lee understands radar very well. He's got a scientific mind, and he also knows gunnery very well. Right? He had won Olympic medals for marksmanship. He knows how to make gunnery, and he knows how to make radar effective. And he had trained or helped train his state to a high level of battle efficiency. He's also got battleship South Dakota and 4 destroyers, like Benham pictured here. Now, unlike Callahan and Scott, Lee is not going to use a linear formation. He's going to descend his destroyers ahead. He's going to use them to screen his battleships. He's going to allow them to mix it up with enemy light forces and help identify targets so that his battleships can keep some distance. And in some respects, that approach works quite well. It's a little bit of a confusing map, but as Washington and South Dakota, as Lee sort of heads around to the west after passing north of Salvo Island, he uses the gunfire of his battleships to disrupt and keep away Kondo's sweeping group, which has come around behind them. So they reverse course to avoid the battleship gunfire and stay out of the battle. Then Lee's destroyers engage with the Japanese screening group that comes around from the west, south of Salvo Island. And Lee's destroyers are very roughly handled in this exchange. Gwynn is the only one of the 4 that ultimately survives. Some of them burn, and Washington, to keep the flames between her and the enemy, maneuvers around to the south of them. South Dakota, unfortunately, suffers power failure, passes the other way. So she's silhouetted by the flames and attracts the attention of the Japanese. They open fire. South Dakota starts being hit repeatedly, and she's in a very troubling state, right? Her action report really makes this plain. There's lots of hits. Control positions are starting to be knocked out. The battleship is essentially blind, doesn't have radar, doesn't know where the enemy is, uncertain how to bring the guns on target. And Lee's hesitant to open fire because although the battleships have SG radars with the PPI display, Washington's radar is mounted on the front of her fire control tower. So it's got a blind spot to the rear. South Dakota had been in that blind spot, and now there's uncertainty because Lee's fire control team is tracking a ship. Is that South Dakota, or is it a Japanese ship? We're not sure. Well, the moon sets, the sound gets darker, and Kondo's flagship, the heavy cruiser Echigo, turns on searchlights to illuminate South Dakota to make it easier to hit her. And at that point, Lee recognizes, okay, that target we're tracking, that is not South Dakota, because South Dakota is over there and South Dakota is in the searchlights. The target is near the searchlights, but it's not the ship with the searchlights. It's something bigger in the background. Open fire. And they do. And Kirishima is the target. And very, very quickly, in a series of well-placed salvos, using, at that point, the best techniques for radar-assisted gunfire, right? They're using visual bearings, but they use radar ranges, they use a rocking ladder, and Kirishima is crippled and essentially left in a sinking condition very quickly. But Lee's not done. Now, the Japanese have lost their battleship. Some of the ships are standing by that ship as it begins to sink. Others are in pursuit of Washington because he is heading northwest. He is approaching the Japanese transports in an effort to delay their arrival at Guadalcanal, which he does. So by the time they get there, the Marine artillery, airplanes from Henderson Field, and a lone destroyer that is now in the Sound, the Meade, shell them and bombard them, and they destroy a lot of the equipment and ammunition that the Japanese have been bringing to the island. So the last major effort to retake Guadalcanal is defeated. But this is not the last action. There's one more, and this marks a bit of a paradigm shift in terms of how these battles are fought. The Japanese are not sending heavy ships to Guadalcanal anymore. They're using groups of destroyers. This is like a Tokyo Express run in that sense, although it's a fairly large one. Rear Admiral Tanaka Raizio's intent is to bring supplies to the island to try to ensure that the Japanese garrison at Guadalcanal can survive and continue to fight. And he's opposed by Rear Admiral Carleton Wright. His flagship is cruiser Minneapolis. Now, Wright's got a problem because he hasn't been in command very long, just a couple of days, and he's handed a battle plan developed by Rear Admiral Kincaid. And Kincaid has studied the prior battles and has a plan. All right, we're going to send destroyers ahead. They will attack with torpedoes using radar. And then once the torpedoes are among the enemy, we will open fire with the cruisers, and we will try to keep them at least 6,000 yards away from the enemy. We'll open fire about double that, maybe 12,000 yards, 10 to 12,000 yards. But we'll try to stay far enough away that we're out of torpedo water. Unfortunately, Kincaid, Wright, other U.S. commanders have no concept of the speed and range and striking power of Japanese torpedoes. Otherwise, they would have known that plan wasn't good enough. Ranges weren't far enough. So Wright expects his destroyers to make a torpedo attack. Fletcher is in the van. She has an SG radar. She had used it to survive the 12-13 November battle unscathed. And that's the intent. But the battle doesn't go according to plan. Fletcher's captain, Commander William Cole, gets into position and he asks permission to open fire with his torpedoes. Wright doesn't think he's in the right spot. Wright doesn't think it's the time to open fire. So he delays giving Cole permission to fire until it's too late. They're out of position, the torpedoes don't hit. And at about the same time that Wright allows Cole to open fire with torpedoes, the cruisers open fire. Destroyer Takanami presents the best radar target, and she's overwhelmed by the fire of the cruisers. That is going to be the only ship that Wright's forces sink. Meanwhile, Tanaka reacts quickly. He abandons his reinforcement or resupply mission, and Captain Sato Tojijiro, who's commanding the van destroyers, Tanaka's van destroyers, takes them ahead at moderate speed, right? Don't make much of a wake, keeps them hidden in the shadow of Guadalcanal, and then turns aggressively to close the range and launch torpedoes. So within a couple minutes after opening fire, there's about 44 torpedoes heading towards Wright's cruisers. One finds Pensacola. And this is a museum in the possession of the National Museum of American History. About that moment, records that moment. The torpedo initiates quite a fire. The other cruisers, all except Honolulu, are hit, right? So this is what happens to New Orleans. She did have 2 forward turrets. She's now only got 1 because the rest of the bow is gone. Minneapolis also loses part of her bow. The 3 of those, Pensacola, New Orleans, and Minneapolis, survive. Northampton does not. She loses power and then afterwards loses the fight against progressive flooding, in part because of fire. Now, Wright thinks he's inflicted a lot of losses. He thinks he's sunk 2 light cruisers, 7 destroyers, but really it's only the 1 Japanese destroyer that sunk. In large part because the gunners of his cruisers are using A-scopes, that's the scope for the fire control, and they lose the target return in all the shell splashes that are being kicked up by the rapid fire of their guns. And so they follow their shell splashes. They don't track when the Japanese destroyers reverse course, and then when they stop shooting, all the splashes stop, all the targets disappear from the radar screens, and they think they've been sunk. But Wright does prevent Tanaka from succeeding in his reinforcement mission. So although the damage to American ships is quite severe and serious, in terms of the balance of the campaign, this is just another nail in the coffin of the Japanese troops that are trying to survive on Guadalcanal. And eventually, Japanese leadership recognizes that they are not going to win the war of resupply for the island, and they abandon their attempts to both recapture it and resupply their troops there. They do quite a clever abandonment of the island and withdrawal of the surviving troops. So General Alexander M. Patch, who assumes command on the island in early December, relieves Vandegrift, is able to signal Halsey on the 9th of February 1943 and say that the Tokyo Express doesn't have a terminus on Guadalcanal anymore. The island has been secured, freeing Halsey to begin to turn his attention to advancing to the northwest, many months after what King and Nimitz had hoped would be the continuation of the initial offensive. So, wrap things up here. These 5 battles are a very serious test of existing, or we could say pre-war, U.S. Navy tactics and doctrine. There are a lot of clear defeats, right? Salvo, a very obvious defeat, and I think it's appropriate to say that Tassavaranga is a clear defeat. Guadalcanal, the first one, Callahan's fight, it's very ugly. Strategically, it's a victory for the U.S. Navy and its allies because it prevents the bombardment of Henderson Field, but the outcome is horrific, essentially. But that ability to tie tactical, if not success, at least a draw, means that Japanese strategic designs are regularly thwarted. They aren't able to mount an offensive that recaptures Guadalcanal. And these victories are a key part of that. And they rely on some of these tactical heuristics developed before the war that I mentioned, right? Aggressive action. U.S. commanders are very aggressive. They emphasize attacking first in these close-range battles off Guadalcanal when radar is unsophisticated and the naked eye is often one of the most important sighting devices. Gunfire is one of the fastest ways to gain an initial advantage, and they rely on that. And we're quite well skilled at that. And also this emphasis on decentralized action that turns into some tactical experimentation, right? Scott introduces this double header, this compact line formation. Callahan comes up with this risky plan to try to penetrate Abe's formation and thereby disrupt its cohesion and prevent the bombardment of Henderson Field. And then Lee's more conventional approach, where the destroyers are a screen to flush out targets for the gunfire of his battleships. Those things work, and the reliance on individual initiative also has an important effect, like Hoover's decision to open fire with Helena with just the Roger response at Cape Esperance, and Halsey's decision to send Lee's battleships into the Sound, which, if you look at intents to use battleships before the war, that probably never would have been considered, right? Send battleships into narrow waters where they can run afoul of enemy light forces and potentially be overwhelmed by close-range gunfire from many directions. Not something that would have been considered, but because Halsey knows he's got to preserve Henderson Field if he's going to win the campaign, Halsey does it. And so I just want to take a little bit of nod to James Hornfisher, who recently left us, whose work has been very good and recognized appropriately so for that, and talk about the inferno at Iron Bottom Sound off Guadalcanal. It's very costly, but the way Halsey and his subordinates approached it allowed the U.S. Navy and its allies to win the campaign and thereby deliver the initiative in the Pacific to Admiral Chester Nimitz. And it is, I think, although we can look at Midway as a very important and momentous step, really where things start to turn, the tide begins to turn, is here with the initial offensive in the Solomons. So with that, I will conclude. I have gone a little bit longer than I intended. I know I've taken an hour, but I am happy to remain on, take questions, exchange ideas. I'm sure some of you have some.
Okay, thank you very much, Trent. That is fascinating, a good presentation, and one of the most interesting 5 months of naval history, I think, the waters off of Guadalcanal. People are welcome to ask questions. You can unmute yourself. I see Carl right there.
Yeah, Carl is ready to go.
Carl is ready to go.
You place a lot of emphasis on this presentation on the development and encouragement of individual initiative by lower ranking commanders in the midst of the action. Can you attribute this to be a conscious reaction to British criticism at Jutland, where more than once British captains withheld opening fire in a critical situation because they didn't have permission to specifically open fire from the flag officer?
That is an excellent question, Carl. I would not attribute it to a direct reaction to that, but what I can say is the Battle of Jutland is studied extensively by the interwar U.S. Navy. Jutland is a regular subject of analysis of the Naval War College and in other places. And in those analyses, what U.S. officers often do is say, well, that's not how we would have behaved. Because they cite their own pre-U.S. entry into World War I experience, experiments in the Atlantic Fleet with the torpedo flotilla, which Sims was the head of for some time. And they were practicing to be fairly aggressive. And so they have an ethos already that is, hey, we need to sort of shoot first and ask questions later, kind of an emphasis on that. And so I think it's not a reaction to so much as, but the observation of the British and what happened to them in their analysis of Jutland reinforces an existing predisposition in the U.S. Navy to be that way. And I think also there's a recognition in the interwar period, there's some encouragement of this because small units is probably wrong when you're talking about like a destroyer division or a cruiser division, but they are encouraged to explore different ideas in the fleet problems, right? There's no rigorous doctrine that you're expected to conform to. Instead, it's here's an operational problem, solve it. Use your initiative to solve it. So they're reinforcing that behavior through the interwar period.
Well, thank you. There's a hand up from the Shermans, young man.
Yes,
So,
yes, we've spoken before.
My question is, what was Kirishima doing on Friday the 13th?
She was shooting at U.S. Navy ships. She was shooting at San Francisco at one point. It's very difficult to construct specifically what happened in that battle, but I'm fairly confident that at one point she was shooting at San Francisco. I think she might have been engaging Helena at another point. There's a very good book by Grace, I think his first name is James, that gets into that battle and tries to recreate it better than any other narrative that I have read. So if you're not familiar with that already, I think that would be a great read to get into. But one of the things to appreciate is just how dark and confusing that fight is. The moon is not up, and it's very difficult to make sense of what's going on. And I'm sure that their crew members of Kirishima are thinking, we're not really sure who's friendly and who's not. And so not unlike I think Lee was a couple nights later, holding fire until they could make sure of a target.
Well, thank you. I think Randy has a hand up too.
Yes, I do. Am I free to go?
You're free to go.
Okay, great. Actually, I kind of have two. One is rather speculative, and the other's I'm going to ask you, Trent, if you could infer a little bit. The first one, speculatively speaking, is at Tassafaranga, what is, given your exposure and research, what is your estimation of how Kinkaid would have handled matters differently than how Wright had handled them? And then on my second question, which I think perhaps you might be able to infer quite a bit for us here, riffing off of your book, Learning War, which I see next to Vince's right shoulder there, and specifically on chapter 6, discussing CIC, I was wondering if you could perhaps venture some comments on how the Japanese handled very similar problems that they were encountering in terms of command and control in these actions. And if you want to go up the slot and away from Guadalcanal to make the points, please feel free if you can do so. Great.
Kinkaid. That's a great question. I am not entirely sure. One of the things, I wrote a piece on Kinkaid some number of years ago, And one of the things that really impressed me about him is he seems to ultimately find the niche where he could be most effective.
Yeah, he's a
Like
thinker.
he goes to the North Pacific, right? He does very well there, and he does very well there in large part because he can collaborate with the Army. And then, wow, he can collaborate with the Army. Let's send him down to the Southwest Pacific. Maybe he can work with MacArthur. Maybe he can solve that. He does. So he's very astute at that kind of thing, and it seems great that he finds that niche. I don't know how he would have performed at Tassafaronga because he does have an aggressive edge. He's not a Halsey, he's not a Burke, he's not quite like that though. He seems to be a little bit more studious and methodical. And to me, it really comes down to what's going to happen between Cole, the CO of Fletcher, and whoever's in charge of the formation. And I think part of the problem is that Cole doesn't have license to just let loose when he thinks he's in the right spot. And I think that probably happens with Wright because, Wright's new and they haven't worked this out. So I think the question really is, would Kincaid have developed sufficient understanding with Cole for Cole to have just fired torpedoes and then said, I've let them go, right? Just inform that I have shot rather than ask permission to do so. And I don't know, maybe, but I think I have doubts because the fact that Cole was doing that with Wright makes me think that maybe he would have done the same thing with Kincaid, which makes me think that Kincaid might also have hesitated because it's very difficult to make sense of everything from, these actions move very, very fast. And if you're doing that, if you're asking permission back and forth, usually you have missed the moment. Now, as far as Japanese capabilities to develop something akin to a combat information center, they don't really succeed with that. I'm not sure why. I see we have John Partial, or at least we did have, yep, there's John. He might know more. He's done a lot more work in the Japanese Navy than I have. But one of the things that has impressed me with, I think it's very dangerous to sort of assume that because the Japanese weren't as good with radar or in certain other means that become very important as the war progresses on, that for whatever reason they might not have been as capable or creative. They don't seem to have been as effective at harnessing lessons, systematically compared to the U.S. Navy. But I'd be really curious to see what John says about that. I think he was moving forward to unmute. So I'll invite him if he wants to, but you can pass.
I don't know that I have anything that profound to say. I do think you're right that the Japanese were not as good at systematically gathering battle lessons, although I do recall some documents being passed to me by the late David Dixon regarding some of the battle lessons that the Japanese have been learning by about 1944, certainly with respect to radar and what it was doing to them in terms of hampering their ability to ever take the initiative on the battlefield or the sea field, if you will. But no, I don't have anything really to impart there. I will ask, as sort of a follow-on to Isaac's earlier question, one of the questions I have with respect to the second naval battle of Guadalcanal, I still can't figure out why it is that Kurita came south without bringing Haruna and Kongo along with Kirishima. To my dying day, I will never understand why they left those two ships basically circling up near Ontong Java Atoll. It's incredible to me.
Yeah, to close the loop on your question, Randy, I think how the Imperial Japanese Navy evolved their sort of shipboard command and control is a subject of research that ought to be pursued. I would love collectively all of us to learn more about that through someone's efforts. Yeah, to John's point, I don't know why the Japanese didn't do that either. I mean, I think this is a marked contrast in terms of how the two navies are thinking about the fighting here, right? So Halsey is essentially pushing his last chips onto the table. We're going to take Washington and we're going to take South Dakota and we're going to put them into the narrow sound here. And that is a risk. That is a big risk. And then on the Japanese side, well, we'll take one of these old battleships and a couple of heavy cruisers and we'll try to do it that way. Why not bring all three of those? Because then it's a very different ballgame. And I don't know why they didn't. I don't know why they didn't do that. I mean, the standard answer would be, oh well, we're preserving ships for like the decisive battle, and you know, you do see that occasionally, some sort of hedging of bets on the Japanese side, but I don't think that's really a great explanation. I think that's kind of a cop out.
Yeah, that seems weak to me too, because Bat Div 3 was no longer really considered worthy to be in the main battle line. So any sort of argument that's based on this notion that they were being held back for the decisive battle just doesn't hold any water as far as I can tell.
Yeah.
John, do we? Just a quick interjection for this. Do we have anyone who's done much work on what the Japanese intel picture was on movement of U.S. ships? If they're operating in the blind, I can seriously understand why they were so reluctant to commit all their forces if they had no idea what the Americans were bringing in. But on the other hand, we were starting to get pretty good grip on what the Japanese were offering from time to time. So has anyone done a tactical intel analysis of the Imperial Navy?
Not, and certainly not for that battle that I am aware of. I mean, I would imagine all of that good stuff is sitting in the Senshi Sosho volumes on Guadalcanal, and you know, God willing, Google Translate will get to the point within our lifetime. Oh, actually, now you shake your head, but here's the thing. Just the other day, I took my phone and took Google Translate and started pointing it at the Senshi Sosho volume for the Battle of Midway, and it actually came up with credible results. So, wow. You know, it's better. But yeah, all the stuff that you want, I'm sure, is inside Senshi Sosho.
Let me turn the floor over to some more questions, because we do have a lot of people who want to pick your brain there, Trent. I think you were next, weren't you, Evan, or was it Len? Well, go ahead and go next, Evan.
Yeah, my question, really August 1942 is the first time that American ships really encountered, and how, I mean, obviously there've been carrier battles before that, but cruisers and destroyers. And how much of what you're talking curve of learning how capable Japanese ships are. And a kind of second question is, were any lessons learned from the Dutch East Indies campaign? Did that was a
Okay. Your question was kind of garbled because we were having some sort of
earlier experience, rather a catastrophic one. But I mean, okay, can you hear me now?
Yes, but it's very intermittent, Evan. We hear pieces of sentences.
It's still garbled?
Perhaps you can go to chat mode. Let me take Len's question next. And why don't you type up your question really fast in chat mode, and that way we can get it.
Sure.
Okay. So why don't you go ahead, Len?
Yeah, Trent, I was wondering, did unit cohesion or the lack of unit cohesion play much of a role in these night battles?
Oh, yes. Yes. Great point, Len. Not something I emphasized. Things don't always make it into the presentation when I think about time and how long it's going to take to talk about these things. But yeah, so, great example of that point is Lee's got 4 destroyers, right? Those 4 destroyers had not operated before. Those 4 destroyers were not a cohesive unit. Those 4 destroyers are the destroyers that have the fuel to make it. And so there are repeated analyses that are decrying the fact that we're throwing scratch teams, pickup teams together to do this. And what I think is interesting is in those analyses, those criticisms, they're saying, we don't have a doctrine. And I think some people have keyed off that and say, oh, the US Navy doesn't have a doctrine for night combat. Well, not exactly. The reason is because doctrine was developed in those cohesive formations, right? That was the job of the formation, was to work out how to fight together, how to use the unique characteristics of those captains and their ships to become a more effective fighting team. And if you don't have time for that cohesion, if you don't have time for that plan, you don't have a doctrine in the US Navy's terminology at the time. So really the only fight that could, well, there are two that could be said to have a doctrine, and one is Scott's. Scott definitely goes in with a plan, and he has rehearsed it and he has practiced it. You might be able to argue Tassafaronga has that because Kincaid has put a plan together, but I don't think it's terribly well practiced, and Wright is obviously not very familiar with it. So that's kind of not great. But yeah, Callahan has nothing, and Lee kind of has what he's developed in his head. And I think partially it works for Lee because, well, his ship can do so well on its own, and he has a smaller group of ships to handle. Callahan's got 13. He doesn't have any hope of making that cohesive.
Thank you. I think Evan is still typing. So do we have any other questions?
It looks like it. We have a nice comment from Hal. He's got Halsey's actual quote when he.
Okay.
Thanks, Hal. All right, here's Evan's question. Were any lessons learned by U.S. Navy about cruiser and destroyer actions with the Japanese from the Dutch East Indies campaign? And I haven't found any evidence that feeds in. I think a lot of the lack of success there.
No, I didn't take her dish.
I know.
Oh shit!
I know. She didn't.
All right.
Hear that.
I think some of that is looked at. It doesn't find its way into any changes in procedures, at least that I've been able to discover in terms of how the United States Navy is approaching night combat. And I think part of the reason is time. It's just it's hard to make sense of that because the people who are writing and talking about that aren't in it. And also there you've got a lot of mixed forces. Right. And so some of the challenges are attributed to that. Like, we don't have a default way of communicating with the Dutch, and this makes fighting a cohesive battle more difficult. We knew that already, of course. We're not gonna have that problem. We have radios, we have cohesive formation. We can figure out how to do this. So I think that's the response.
Wasn't Cole commanding a destroyer in Java Sea?
I don't know.
No, you're thinking of Parker.
Am I thinking of Parker?
Yeah, Cushing.
Okay.
And he was at the Java Sea with a Parrot, maybe?
Okay.
But there were others.
Okay, Daniel, your hand is up.
Daniel, you're still muted. We cannot hear you.
Now, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hear you.
Great. Yeah, a question about Gormley, who is just a fascinating character in all of this to me, especially why Nimitz tolerated him so long. And I recall reading in E.B. Potter's biography of Nimitz that it was later found that Gormley was suffering from a number of abscessed teeth. And speaking as somebody who had once had an abscessed tooth, I mean, that can get subtly, get your attention without you realizing it. And I don't know if you have any sense that his leadership failures could have been due to just some massive distraction like that, because it's really inexplicable otherwise.
Yeah, I think that's a wonderful point, and thank you for bringing that up. What I think Nimitz keyed off of more, because probably he didn't have knowledge of the abscess tooth at the time, was Gormley stays on his flagship, Argonne. He doesn't move ashore. Argonne doesn't have the communication facilities necessary to really coordinate what's going on in the South Pacific. And also something that Nimitz was very aware of, even I cannot remember him commenting on this specifically in the minutes of the meetings, but if you're on the ship, it's hard to get exercise. And Nimitz makes it a habit to daily get exercise, go for walks or throw horseshoes or swim, things like that, right? Gormley can't do any of those things. He's just stuck on the ship trying to handle all this. And so I think your point that there are distractions that prevent him from bringing his full attention, or best attention, let's say, to the challenge of commanding in the South Pacific is right. Some of that may have been the tooth. Some of that may have been his failure to develop a headquarters ashore. And I think also he's really set off by the defeat at Savo. I mean, there's a very clear sort of, he's not as aggressive or as positive on the offensive as Nimitz and King are, but he's showing some elements of being interested in how to make this work. And then after Savo happens, it's like, oh my gosh, they're gonna take Guadalcanal and then they're gonna come after Numia. How do I stop that? And he gets this very defensive attitude.
Let me interject. Carl's been doing some research on this. I think you have something to add, Carl.
Yeah, just something just to add. His son related to me that he also suffered periodically throughout the rest of his life from a damaged kidney from an academy football injury. And I can imagine under the stressful physical and psychological protracted stress, the teeth get the attention, you can deal with the teeth. But he had an internal medical issue that kept dogging him throughout the rest of his life, and no one's ever brought that out in previous publications.
Wow, I did not know that. Thank you for bringing that up.
Yeah, it was a treasure trove of info from his son when he brought some documents up and mentioned, oh, by the way, because we discussed the tooth issue, and he says, well, it wasn't so much the teeth as it was the kidney problem. I said, what kidney problem?
Yeah.
It's really interesting. Is that got your questions, Dan?
Yeah, that's great. Thanks.
Okay, Randy, your hand is up again.
Yeah, my wife is always after me too. I got to let her know where I'm at. Trent, again, going back to learning war and your notes in the back, I could give you the sites and everything, but the issue here is the awareness that the USN had of the Type 93, the Long Lance, or Japanese torpedoes in general. Do we have anything definite? As far as I know, the USN only up to April 45 ever got hold of a single unexploded weapon. And I don't think it could have arrived in their hands any earlier than mid-43 and probably later. And it's been suggested it came off of Dinagat Island after Surigao Strait. Do you have those sources there? And I have some other papers from independent of that from Ainsworth, where he's claiming they had no notion that greater than 12,000 yards was what the Japanese could reach out with.
Yeah, they didn't. I saw John on mute, so I'll give him a chance to chime in on this. He and I were just exchanging emails about a month ago.
This is a question that I'm actually super interested in myself, because as part of this night combat book that we're working on, there's been a lot of, if you do your web trolling as to when we first came into, any sort of knowledge about this weapon, it's all over the map. I think I have the same Bureau of Ordnance pamphlet that you have that shows that photograph, and that pamphlet, if I'm not mistaken, was written in April of 1945 and says, yeah, this is the only Type 93 that we have captured thus far.
Exactly.
At the same time, though, there's two different photographs that were taken of a weapon that came up on the beach near the Cape Esperance on Guadalcanal. One of those is in the photo archives at Naval History and Heritage Center. I actually just got done writing to the photo curator there because I've seen a second version of the same weapon, and it's got to be in Nara someplace. I've got the record group for it, but I'm not exactly proximate to Nara. So in any case, my best guess is it's around July of 43 was when Ainsworth writes that report. Is that right, Trent?
Well, no, it's later, because Ainsworth is when he's writing his action reports from those battles, Kula Gulf and Kula Mangara. And by that time, he has no idea what the Long Lance can do. He's still thinking about 10,000 yards is going to keep him out of torpedo water, and it won't.
And it's interesting too, because that one report mentions that, one of the vessels had been struck by one of these torpedoes, and, they measured the hole that it made, and they're absolutely convinced, this is a 21-inch weapon. And it's like, no. So, yeah, middle of 1943, no, we still have no clue as to the performance parameters of that torpedo.
Yeah, it really starts to emerge. That letter, I mean, there's a piece that Ainsworth writes because there's some criticism of his handling of those battles. And it's later, I forget the exact date, but it's later in 43 that he writes that, basically saying, look, we thought this is how far they could reach. And oh, by the way, now I've just been told there's a 24-inch torpedo up on a beach somewhere.
Yeah.
And wow.
Yeah.
If I could interject real quick and pick on John here, going to the site too. I think we got on those pictures for Cape Esperance, I think we got to watch out between a Type 90 and a Type 93. Like the Neon Kaigun site doesn't even, as far as I know, doesn't even mention the Type 90 yet. It was up there and in quite a few numbers too. So it's possible that 24-inch torpedo those pictures are of a Type 90. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying we have to be aware of that.
No, that's a good point. And then that begs the question, well, how long has that stupid fish been on that beach? And what battle was it fired in and who by? Because then you'd have to go back and start looking at, okay, well, were there Fubukis, close by enough that had, the opportunity to fire a Type 90? And you'll pardon me on not updating the website. I've been writing books and stuff. I
know that.
I haven't worked on Combined Fleet for years and years. If it weren't for Tony and his group of merry men, I mean, God bless them for keeping the thing alive. So. Well,
I only nailed you because you're a good representative, but I've been after Tony on that as well. But I mean, Atlanta supposedly is hit by Type 93, but if Koski or Inazuma or one of those is firing the torpedo, it's going to be a Type 90 at this point, because none of the Fubukis, only 6 ever got Type 93s. And those were, I got the dates, but those are much later in the war. I think Yugiri is the first one in 43. But down at Guadalcanal, they would be Type 90s on Fubukis.
I think we've gone down the rabbit hole and we should let
back out. I do want to mention some of the things that Terry's been putting in the chat, because I think these are some very good comments. I want to draw attention to them. One is that Gormley didn't have the joint vision for the campaign that Halsey did. I think that's an excellent point, especially when it comes to logistics. I tried to stress the importance of resupply to Guadalcanal. One of the things that Halsey does when he or soon after taking command is he changes the approach to logistics in the South Pacific and makes more effective use of Army logisticians. That's very important. And then another note here about Longlands, less impactful in the later destroyer battles of the campaign in 43 because the battles were fought at closer range. I'm not sure exactly the point you're making there, Terry, because I think some of the 43 battles are longer range than the ones off Guadalcanal anyway. But maybe I'm misunderstanding something.
Yeah, I'm just reflecting that the destroyer battles in up the northeastern chain of the Solomons 43 were kind of knife fights in the night between the destroyers, and everybody was slinging torpedoes by that point. And interestingly enough, the P sub Ks of torpedoes throughout the campaign was about 0.1. So you'd fire about 10 to get one hit, and eventually people like Burke realized that, and that's what kind of drove those battles. So I'm not sure they were thinking about the long range impact, the kind of the cruise missile impact that the Long Lance had in the early battles in Iron Bottom Sound.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. Yes, Burke clues into, wait, we can use CICs, we can use SG radars, we can coordinate multiple formations at night, and we can make a surprise torpedo attack. Let's give this a shot. Works pretty well.
Do we have more questions? I'll make a comment. I have a question. I've always wondered about Admiral Callahan, and he obviously drew a very tough assignment. And the historiography has been pretty much unanimous that he perhaps wasn't the man for the job. Some people will even go so far as to say Scott should have been in command because of his experience, which I don't think Scott would have done any different. But you made the point that he wanted to use his heavy cruisers as kind of like a line buster force. That's just speculation based upon. I mean, I've read various accounts. Well, one positive account saying he was faced with an impossible task and did the best that he could, and paid the ultimate price. And that might be true. Do you have any comments on that further?
Yeah, one of the things that I think is important, he's Gormley's chief of staff, and deliberately is like, okay, Gormley's out, give me a task force. But he had he'd been in those conferences with Nimitz, so I'm not sure exactly what he's thinking, but I know that he's been impressed with the importance of the fighting at Guadalcanal. Nimitz in those conferences, because there's representatives not just of the South Pacific, the Southwest Pacific. MacArthur's subordinates are saying, we need more forces. We're hard pressed too. All the navies over there at Guadalcanal. And Nimitz's point is, yeah, because this is the decisive spot. This is where we're going to stop them. And so that's why all the naval forces are here. And so I think Callahan has a sense of how important this campaign is, and he takes that with him into this fight. Yeah, it's not a great situation that he's got now. This line busting idea, I don't think it's the pre-war formations are using cruisers more or less as line busters, like use their gunfire to open a hole in an enemy screen. And that's not exactly what Callahan does. I think Callahan inverts that a little bit. He lets his destroyers kind of exhaust themselves. I mean, several of them do break through the Japanese screen, which is not very cohesive at the moment of contact. But I think he's trying to let the destroyers mix it up in the screen and then use the cruisers to try to get close to the Japanese battleships. And I really hit on that. I mean, first there are his actions, his orders, his command to, we want the big ones. But what really got me thinking about that was a series of fire effect charts at the Naval War College in their archives. And they are looking at, suppose we have our US Navy heavy cruisers, and suppose we are fighting one of these Japanese fast battleships. What do the fire effect curves look like at various ranges? And at distant ranges, right, a Japanese battleship is more effective than a pair or three of these cruisers. There's an inflection point that you hit, depending on how many cruisers you have, the range differs, but there's an inflection point you hit at closer ranges where the fire of the cruisers are expected to be greater. And so I think Callahan had some familiarity with those charts, or at least the theories, if not the charts themselves, and did some mental calculations on the way back to Iron Bottom Sound and thought, okay, this is the answer I have.
That makes a lot of sense to me. That makes a lot of sense. And we shouldn't forget San Francisco was the one who put the nail in the coffin of that particular battleship.
Yeah. And I think he's thinking that in some respects, because that is, I think he realizes he's not going to be able to exert control of the entire formation. And so, well, let's let the destroyers do their own thing, and maybe the light cruisers work with the small light cruisers, work with the destroyers, and I'll keep my three cruisers together, and we will try to do this. We'll hit one battleship, and then we'll hit the other. And I mean, we could sit here and say, yeah, that's not going to work. We know that's not going to work, and I'm sure he's telling himself the same thing. But he's also thinking, what else have I got?
Yeah, he's not a stupid man. He's not doesn't have a death wish. So there's got to be more going on there. And do we have more questions?
Vince, Don Patton.
Don, go ahead.
Don.
Hi. I wanted to thank Trent for coming out to Minnesota 3 years ago, I guess it was, to do a similar presentation. Was it 4?
No, I don't know, 3 or 4.
Well, no, Trent, but Trent came out also. And,
yeah. That was great.
But since this is the Western Naval Historic Nerds, I wanted to point out that you're being infiltrated by the Midwest with John Parshall, with Brian Walter. And I want you to see that John Parshall has been corrupting this young man that intervened early, Isaac. We're very proud of what the mafia that John Parshall is forming here in the Midwest to infiltrate you Western naval guys.
Those Midwesterners. The sad secret of it is that all of us people from the West Coast, my grandfather was born in Minneapolis, for example. My first wife was from Minneapolis, for example.
Well,
Good
listen,
status.
I actually do have a question that kind of goes to a couple of things of getting back to the development of radar. One of the people that I had on one of the programs years back was mayor of a adjacent suburb of Minneapolis, Richfield. And he was a radar man, I think either on the California or the Oklahoma. I think maybe the California at Pearl Harbor. And for some reason, it sticks in my mind that was the first naval ship that had radar. Has there been any work on the development installation of radars in the naval fleet in the beginning of World War II?
Yes, there's been a good deal of that. California is not the first. Probably going to get it wrong, but my memory is that Texas and New York get competing sets.
Say that again, Trent. I couldn't hear.
Texas and New York. I think they get the first ones. They get competing. They get competing sets. They get alternative variants that are then trialed and tested. And they are surprised with how well these things work. I think part of the surprise at SAVO is based on pre-war use of these in environments that are much less constricted, that are not littoral, that are more open sea. And the radars, you can see on some of them shells as they fly out toward the target, right? They get a return. So they think they're really going to help them see and understand what's going on in the darkness. And if they don't, there's not enough understanding of its limitations. There's not enough understanding of how you have to use additional tools to make sense of the information that radar provides you.
Right.
Like through a plot is really what the solution comes to be. But without that, it's and you see it in these battles. Most of the reports are fragmentary. Like, we have a contact, it's at this range and it's at this bearing. Is that a relative bearing or is that a true bearing? Is it moving? How fast is it moving if it's moving? And they can't exchange information fast enough to allow the commanders of these formations to make sense of these things.
I think operator fatigue is a factor as well, particularly on the blue.
Oh yeah, I agree with you completely. Yeah. So Don, that has been looked into. I would have to go searching, but the Bureau of Ordnance itself has written some good histories about the introduction of radar and its use. So it's out there. It has been traced.
But would it be true that again, it was probably the California?
Yeah, I think you're right.
Was one of the early, or was it maybe the only?
California has a big search radar at Pearl Harbor. You can see it in the photographs. Yeah, so California is probably right.
Yeah, it was CXAM1.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's just amazing, we take radar for granted and everything, today. I mean, just as a guy that just passed over 80 and in age, I just marvel at the technological advancements that have been made in my lifetime. And radar, GPS as it's evolved today, we just take it so much for granted and don't see that evolution from the beginning of World War II.
Mm-hmm.
We've pretty much hit our time limit here. I know that this has been a very interesting session. Randy, do you have another question?
Yes, I do. As a matter of fact, of Trent, we're hearing a lot about radar and so forth, and communications during actions and whatnot. How many radio circuits, how many channels with which commanders or captains are communicating with? How many are out there on any given battle? Are we talking just one or perhaps two channels, or how's that working? Seems like that would be an awful crowded conversation.
Yeah, it is a crowded conversation. My understanding is that, they have other circuits, but for this coordination in battle, you're using the TBS circuit, the TBS circuit. So
Doesn't the TBS have multiple circuits you can switch, like
I
2 or
think
3?
I think
Four, I
it
think
does.
4.
Yeah, but most of it's all, I mean,
On one
there
circuit.
are, there are numerous, like throughout all of the action reports for these fights, there are assessments.
TBS logs, yeah.
Yeah, well, not the logs, about how crowded it gets.
Oh, yeah.
Messages get lost because there's not enough. I mean, they get more sophisticated with the management of circuits as the war goes on, using different circuits for different things or different levels of the command hierarchy. But my understanding through all these fights is they're using a single circuit.
Thank you.
Okay. Well, I'm going to go ahead and wrap up this session. Thank you very much, Trent. I want to invite everybody to be sure to come next month on middle of August, and we'll have Carlos Rivera, Dr. Rivera, will be presenting on a early or late 19th century topic, which is kind of unusual for us. Carlos, can you unmute and just give us a little bit of a preview?
Yeah, 19th century, no technology, right?
Radio?
Yeah, well, no, I'm going to get you an email because I found something you were looking for.
Oh, good.
On Royal Navy and radio. Some of you know me. I've been working on progressive era Japanese and American officers after they become professionals, and I'm looking at what they achieved as a professional. And I'm also looking at the aspect of the hypothetical enemy between the United States Navy and the Japanese Navy before 1918. So everybody knows Akiyama and what he did with the Battle of Tsushima Straits and things like that, and then setting the ground for the 70% and the 88 fleet concept. But before he became famous, he was also quite intelligent and took advantage of the opportunity when he had a 3-year tour to the United States. So I'm going to talk about that.
Okay. It'll be a fascinating topic. I mean, something that we don't hear a lot about, and looking forward to it. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and call it a session. Thank you very much, Trent. We really appreciate it. We appreciate your input and your responding so well to all these different questions. And thank you, everybody, and see you next month. So,
thank you. I love all the
ciao,
questions.
ciao.